The kinds of patterns that we've described in Canada of falling fertility and longer lifespans are not just occurring here. They are, in fact, occurring across the world. And it's important to understand what's driving some of these trends. First off, we have an increase in people's lifespans driven by improvements in medicine. Not only has childhood mortality fallen, but people are living longer in old age. The number of years that they're expected to live post-retirement has been regularly increasing over the last few years, which of course strains the budgets of social welfare programs that elders are not contributing to, but are drawing from as their numbers swell. The other side of this is that a swelling number of elders wouldn't be a problem if we had a swelling number of taxpayers or of contributing workers beneath them generating the surplus necessary to fund them. But unfortunately, what we've seen is a combination of industrialization and urbanization has driven down fertility rates to well below replacement levels. Now, this puts us in a twofold economic challenge at the same time. Not only are we going to see populations peak and begin to decline with all of the challenges associated of a shrinking workforce, but we're also going through a demographic inversion where the aggregate age of our citizens is changing dramatically. Where we once had demographic pyramids that involved having half the population under the age of 15, we're now moving into a situation where as many as a quarter of the population will in fact be over the age of 65, with fewer and fewer children being born each year. So this is a serious potential problem for social programs whose entire funding model relies on there being more bodies in the future to contribute to these types of expenditures. So one of the key concerns we have is with pay-go programs. As we described, more and more people will be drawing on these pension plans and drawing on these social benefits and these healthcare benefits, despite the fact that fewer and fewer people are likely to be contributing to them. We see this problem particularly in places with older economies, places like South Korea, Japan, or Germany, which are already beginning to strain their state budgets as there are fewer and fewer people contributing to the tax base and an ever-increasing number of people drawing on retirement benefits. So this is a major problem that we will ultimately have to deal with. While there may be some countries like Japan, South Korea, and Germany who are the leading edge of this transition, this is the future of almost all industrial societies. Urbanization, medicine, and industrialization don't really have different impacts on different kinds of societies in the sense that all of them will drive up lifespans and all of them will drive down birth rates. So what we're seeing as a general trend in the developed world today is likely to be the future of almost all nations over the next 100 years as industrialization, modern medicine, and urbanization continue to roll out. Now, I think it's probably worth it for us to talk about a few of the major economies and how it is that they're confronting these types of challenges, because people have recognized since the 1980s and 90s, when fertility rates first started to bottom out compared to what we'd seen in the 60s, that things were going to have to change. One of the first few countries to experience this sort of demographic aging and the cost of its welfare state skyrocketing was Japan. Between 1975 and 1990, the percent of GDP spent on its welfare state triples from 6% of GDP to 18% of GDP as the population grew older and fewer children were being born. They attempted to reform several of these programs along the way, but the trend continued to worsen and has continued to worsen, leading to shifts in Japan's national strategy. Rather than simply relying on local people to work in local factories, Japanese industry began building factories where they could hire local workers to build things for themselves, simply because there was not enough Japanese workers to build all of the things that Japan Inc. wanted to sell to the world. Now, with its worker to retiree ratio effectively in terminal decline, Japan now has a relatively small menu of choices it faces. It can try to raise taxes, can try to scale back the benefits of its welfare programs, it can try to change its attitudes towards immigration, or it can invest heavily in automation and robotics as a way of trying to enhance the productivity of those few workers which remain. I leave it to the viewer to try to determine which of these the Japanese are most heavy to lean into, but no surprise, it's robots. Now, looking at a few other major economies, in the United States, we have significantly underfunded social programs. Two important social welfare programs in the US, Medicare/Medicaid and Social Security, already face significant financing issues. So despite America's younger demographics, where it is able to enjoy the benefits of immigration and continued higher fertility, the issue is that these two social programs continue to be underfunded. We know that demographically there's going to be a substantial increase in the number of people who are drawing on these programs, and the resources simply are not there for the government to support this kind of spending. Now, when we try to scale this, we look at the cost of medical insurance provided by the government, with Medicare and Medicaid program, for instance, costing about 5 to 5.5% of GDP currently. Congressional Budget Office in the US estimates that that number will rise to approximately 20% by 2080. So we're looking at an almost quadrupling of the government's expenses on medical insurance for its citizens. Now, of course, there are things that America could do about this. Just like Japan, it faces a number of options. It's already engaging in automation solutions. It's already engaged in immigration. The only things that are left for it to do really are to raise taxes or to cut benefits. Given the challenge of slashing back benefits, most people expect that America will in time need to raise taxes in order to be able to meet these kinds of obligations. In fact, the level of taxes would be required to meet these obligations is in fact substantially higher than it is now. It's estimated that by 2080, America would need to have a tax take at the federal level of about 50% higher than it is today. This is not to say 50% of all GDP will go to the government. That's not it at all. 50% increase in government revenues from where they are today would be required in order to meet their obligations by 2080. Now, there are some substantial challenges with this, but they're not insurmountable, provided that people are willing to make the sacrifices necessary today to ensure that we still have a brighter future ahead. So on that note, let's talk really quickly about Canada's future. Canada's future is, like every other nation that is facing these kinds of changing demographics, largely concerned with the amount of dependence that we will have. One of the interesting things to note is that while we have seen a decline in the number of children and an increase in the number of elders, the overall dependency rate, the overall number of people who are surviving off of the surplus created by others, dips at first in the 1980s and 90s and then begins to rise. Economically speaking, a reduction, as we see here, from about 1980 through about 2021 in the overall dependency ratio enabled Canadians to profit from a demographic dividend. We didn't have as many children or as many elders to support. And so we had an opportunity to invest this money personally into a number of different things. The challenge is that those days are now gone. In the 2020s and 2030s, you will note that this is the period of transition moving into 2030, where we will move to a higher dependency ratio from about 60% to as high as 80%. And almost all of this is going to be driven by an increase in our responsibilities to our elders. So there simply will be less disposable household income. What we've become acclimatized to over the last 30 to 40 years is going to drip away over the next 10 years as we move towards a new financial equilibrium. Historically, households spent a lot of money raising children. Now households are going to spend a lot of money supporting their elders. This might seem balanced, but it's important to remember that children grow up to become workers and taxpayers. The elderly don't return to the workforce. And so even while we might be able to make the books balance for a while, and it might seem reasonable for us to have a similar to historical dependency ratio, we should remember that once again, demographic inversion with fewer and fewer children is going to lead to a situation where we simply have an inverted pyramid, not nearly enough workers to support the elders and the benefits that we've promised to them. Therefore, Canada's solution has largely been immigration to try to broaden that base to the extent possible and to slow down the rate at which we hit this particular point. Now, thankfully, unlike a country like the Netherlands or Japan, Canada isn't exactly full. We still have a lot of space to be able to move people in. And we've adopted social cultures and political systems that have made it easy for people to move to Canada and to hopefully integrate into our economic system. Nonetheless, there are challenges down the road for us, and it's important for us to recognize that as the baby boomers move into mass retirement in the next 5 to 10 years, that we're going to see substantial changes in the structure of our economy and potentially in the structure of some of how our corporations are organized. Now, at the end of the day, one of the things we're going to need to be concerned with is the culture that we have towards our elders. Quite frankly, we have spent a great deal of time over the last few centuries, particularly with the rise of the Industrial Revolution, downplaying the potential value that our elders hold for us in society. The idea was that old people move slow in a factory and therefore they should get out of the way for young workers. Well, that might be true in a labor-based economy, but we are moving in the 21st century very rapidly from an industrial economy based on labor to a knowledge-based economy where human capital can be used long after your body is simply not able to keep up with it. In a knowledge-based economy, people who are 70 and 80 years old aren't necessarily forced into retirement because while their bodies might not be able to lift lumber in the yard all day or mine in a pit, they're certainly able to keep thinking. And it would be a great disservice to our society if we were to dismiss excellent doctors or economists or lawyers or other kinds of knowledge workers, even librarians. The idea of dismissing knowledge workers who are not worn out because they simply need to move out to pasture is old thinking, and it's damaging thinking for our society. There are a large number of people who can continue to contribute in very, very meaningful ways, millions of them post-retirement. And unless we're willing to adjust our culture, which thinks of getting elders out of the way so that Gen X can move into those jobs behind them, we're going to end up being poor. This is a misguided set of policies. The idea that we need to move our elders out of the way for the young people to come in behind them and have their chance to be in charge is a misreading of the map. This is not to say that there should be no generational handing off of authority, only that the young should probably remember that our elders have accumulated 30, 40, sometimes 50 years of relevant experience in their knowledge-based professions, and that we still have a lot to learn from them, regardless of the age differences between us. So I'd like to close off this talk by pointing to a couple of important industry analyses that were conducted in Germany regarding their economic transition. So I've got a few of them here that I think really drive the point home. When they spoke with Deutsche Bank, the economists who are putting together this report were able to source the following quote. And noted that in operational work, older employees could be slow, but they make up for that with fewer mistakes, so that in the end, they're no less productive. If we had teams with only older people, they'd be too slow. If we had teams with only younger ones, there'd be too many mistakes. So Deutsche Bank's approach has actually been to integrate its older and younger workers together, allowing the younger workers who might be able to work more quickly and with greater determination to use the best practices developed by older workers so that they don't need to reinvent the wheel every time the generation changes over. A quote from Mercer Consulting similarly captures this exact idea. In their report, Mercer Consulting noted that the contribution of older workers is in the increased productivity of those around them. So even though I might slow down how quickly I could get the job done, simply being able to tell other people how to do it faster and more productively enhances overall productivity simply by having those elder, more experienced workers nearby to be able to guide the younger workers. Max Planck Institute notes that in repetitive work, productivity falls with age, but with knowledge work, an essential part of our developed economies, it makes no difference. In jobs requiring social skills, productivity actually increases with age. And so if we're going to try to navigate our future challenges associated with demographic inversion, as regards meeting the state's welfare obligations, it may be important for us to rethink the culture that we have. It may require us to think of the world in different ways and to try to imagine new uses for our existing assets. In this case, the human capital built up by older generations.